Well, Borough wardens are crying foul over a new home quarantine policy. In a policy that starts December 14th, travelers will be allowed to quarantine at home during the last 4 days of their 14-day quarantine period. That home will need to be empty of all other people unless those people are fully vaccinated. Borough wardens have been given the task of enforcing this home quarantine policy, but they say it will be extremely hard to check whether travelers are following the rules.
Here at
Taipei's Guangwu Borough office, it's an intense training session on conducting home quarantine checks. A big wave of returnees is expected ahead of the Lunar New Year, and new policy will let them spend the last 4 days of quarantine in their home. Borough offices are bracing for a spike in workload.
Last year with the pandemic, when home quarantine started, all the borough offices' resources were devoted to checking up on home quarantiners. Last year, we had more than 100 people in home quarantine. This year, we're expecting twice as many.
To free up space at quarantine hotels, holiday arrivals will be subject to a revised quarantine policy. The first 10 days after arrival must be spent at a quarantine hotel or quarantine center. If travelers test negative in 2 PCR tests after arriving, they will be allowed to return home for the last 4 days of quarantine. In general, the rule for home quarantine is 1 person per residence, but a traveler may quarantine in a room inside the family home if the whole family is fully vaccinated against COVID. Borough wardens say it'll be hard to check whether arrivals are following the rules.
If their family members have all received 2 doses of a COVID vaccine, the returnee can stay with them. But how can we determine if they're fully vaccinated? Are we to make the call? If a friend visits their apartment, we have no way of knowing who they are, whether they are family. This is very troublesome for us. We also can't get volunteers to help us out due to laws on personal data protection. The government will have to draft a plan early on. How many unused spaces do we have? Perhaps through an allocation of manpower, these spaces can be converted into quarantine capacity. Similarly, will there be enough personnel to handle PCR testing at the end of the hotel isolation, just before travelers go home and before they start home quarantine?
The doctor says the government should try to open up more quarantine facilities. Meanwhile, borough wardens say it's unclear whether vaccines administered abroad count as full vaccination for returnees' family members. They're asking for more details on the CECC's policy to ensure proper enforcement of its pandemic strategy.